Should we reveal everything now? I guess so. What are you guys talking about? Is it that secret you mentioned before we left? Yes. You know you're the baggage in our lives, right? So, we decided to get rid of unnecessary baggage. What? What are you talking about? Wait a minute. Then, take care. Don't let your disability defeat you, live strong. My mother threw her bag out of the car window, and the car with my parents drove away. I was born with a leg condition and used a wheelchair. Unable to do anything, I could only wait for my grandmother, who was supposed to come. 2 hours later, it got dark, and I was crouching in fear. I thought it was the wind, but every rustling in the bushes brought an indescribable anxiety. About 30 minutes later, a car arrived. Huh? Alone? What's going on? Grandma. Seeing my grandmother getting out of the car, I burst into tears of relief. Despite being shaken by my sudden tears, my grandmother carefully helped me into the car, and we set off for my grandparents' house. In the car, I explained the situation to my grandmother as best as I could. It seems like my parents have abandoned me. What? Leaving a child alone in the mountains to abandon them? Can such a thing really happen? I had thought the same thing when I was left behind by my parents. But it had indeed happened. But why would they do such a thing? They said I was life's baggage. Unnecessary baggage should be disposed of. No way, that can't be. When we arrived at my grandparents' house, I explained the situation to my grandfather as well. Of course, my grandfather was furious. My grandmother started getting angry too. However, when I shared a certain story, their anger subsided, and their expressions returned to normal. My grandparents faced each other and began to mutter quietly. There seemed to be something odd about my story. My grandparents explained it in a way even a middle school student like me could understand. After hearing the story, I could no longer think of my parents as my parents. The baggage they were talking about was like an unnecessary extra tagging along for a purpose, wasn't it? Nicole, you are not baggage at all. Don't worry. Who really is the baggage, I wonder? Would you help me make them understand? Seeing my grandmother's confident smile, I felt reassured. I hadn't heard the details yet, but I had already decided to cooperate with my grandmother. I'm Nicole, a first-year middle school student. I've been living in a wheelchair my entire life because I was born unable to move my legs. I have a neurological disorder that prevents my brain from sending signals to my legs. Using a wheelchair means I face many challenges in daily life. Even a small step of about 4 inches, which my friends can easily step over, seems like a huge barrier to me. Because of this, I often find myself not wanting to leave the house. This isn't because I have bad experiences outside, but rather because my home is too comfortable. How is it? The new door is easier to open, right? Yes, thank you. Now most of the doors in the house are sliding doors. It must be tough to push or pull doors in a wheelchair. By the way, the handrails in the bathroom are getting old, aren't they? Maybe it's time to replace those too. I was delighted with the new door, sliding it back and forth, while my father began to clean up the tools spread out on the floor. My father owns a construction business and has been working on making their home barrier-free. Not only did they change the doors to sliding doors, which are easier to open with a wheelchair, but they also removed steps and placed light switches within easy reach for someone in a wheelchair. As a result, the house is so comfortable that I find it troublesome to go out where it's inconvenient. If there's anything else that's inconvenient or bothering you, don't hesitate to tell me. My father often says this. However, he has his own work, so I hesitate to ask too much. Thinking this, I've never actually asked him to make a specific change. Because I never say anything, my father often goes ahead and makes our home more accessible without my asking. And every time he finishes a project, he scolds me. That's why I told you to speak up if something is inconvenient. Each time, I feel his kindness. No matter how much he scolds me, I never ask him to do any work. Apart from not wanting to trouble him, there's another reason. Our family is poor because you're in a wheelchair and I can't go out to work. So don't be selfish asking for things you want. My mother often says we're poor as if it's a catchphrase. I remember she started saying this around when I was in the 1st grade. At that time, even as a child, I was impressed by how clearly she said it. While my father does the work, even doors aren't free. And the home improvements don't make us any money. I realized this when I was in upper elementary school, and I started to hesitate to ask my father to do any work. However, thanks to him doing the work himself, our home is quite comfortable. Also, my mother being straightforward with her child about being poor is probably part of her way of teaching me not to take advantage of people around us. I thought I was loved by my parents. But that was only because I was still a child and didn't understand anything. Around the time I reached upper elementary school, I began to understand my parents' thoughts more. I thought I had been loved by my parents, but it seems that might not be the case. I'll load the baggage on this side, you take that side. This is heavy, it's always a hassle. I'm sorry. After shopping at the mall and returning to the car, my mother loaded the trunk with the purchases, and my father helped me into the car. To my parents, I am just another piece of baggage, like groceries or household items. When I get in the car, I don't want to look at my legs, so I look out the window instead. I would like to argue that I am not just baggage, but I cannot say anything since I am only a burden to my parents. At home, I am also treated as an inconvenience by my parents. Hey, why are you in the hallway? It's narrow, isn't it? I was thinking of going to the bathroom. Bad timing? Haven't I always told you to check our locations and move so you're not in the way? I'm sorry. I've told you to stay still at the edge of the living room because you're in the way when you move. Really, you're such a hassle. A cardboard box that doesn't move would be better. Even though I said I was going to the bathroom, my mother moved me to the edge of the living room. If I move now, I'll be called a nuisance again, so I probably have to hold it in a bit longer before I go. To distract myself, I watch a TV show I'm not interested in intently. Understanding more things isn't always good. Now that I'm in upper elementary school, I can understand my parents' true feelings. The harsh words from my parents cut too deeply for an elementary school student. Every time I am treated like baggage by my parents, I feel pain in my heart. However, an elementary school student can't live without depending on their parents. Gradually, I began to watch my parents' expressions and tried to be as little of a nuisance as possible. Aren't you going out today either? No. I'll just watch TV at home. That's good. It's helpful when you stay home. I see my parents off at the entrance as they leave for shopping. They won't be back until around the time the night drama ends on TV. Not wanting to be seen as a nuisance, I started to avoid going out with my parents and ended up staying home alone more often. When I say I won't go with them, my parents smile. Seeing their smiles, I feel useful and smile back. Looking back now, I think my feelings were quite distorted at that time. For me back then, not being a burden was all that mattered, and I believed their smiles were the result of my efforts. I was satisfied with the results of my efforts, but when I was in 6th grade, a minor incident occurred, and it felt like my efforts were reset. Nicole, do you use a wheelchair at home too? Yes, but my dad has made the house wheelchair accessible, so I don't need help from everyone like at school. I can handle being home alone easily. With the new school year, there was a class change. Children who had never been in the same class as me were very curious about my wheelchair, and during breaks, people would gather around me. This became a kind of routine after class changes, and I was used to it. However, it seems I said something not so great this time. One of my classmates told the teacher about me being home alone, and the teacher made a phone call to my home. She's in 6th grade, she can handle being home alone. Why does the school have to fuss about it? Really, why did you talk about being home alone? Now you've caused a hassle. I'm sorry. It seems the teacher warned my parents that it's dangerous to leave a child alone at home late into the night. Because of this, I was no longer allowed to stay home alone, becoming a burden to my parents again. But, as a kind of replacement or measure, my mother gave me an order. You should attend an after-school care service. What's that? My mother showed me a brochure for the facility. The brochure featured photos of children my age studying and diligently making things. The after-school care service appears to be a facility for acquiring necessary life skills and creating opportunities for social interaction, sort of like a cross between a children's club and a senior daycare service, but for people with disabilities. Honestly, it's expensive to send you to this facility. But you're in a wheelchair, and your father and I can't always help you. I want you to make friends and receive training here, so you can develop the skills to survive in society when you're older. If I were younger, I might have thought my mother loved me. However, now that I'm in 6th grade, I sort of understand her real intentions. She probably doesn't want to keep me, who has become a burden, at home. I understand. I'll attend the facility after school and on holidays. I'm glad you understand. That helps me. Children can understand and think about more things than adults realize. I pretended not to notice my mother's true feelings. Unaware of my act, my mother believed my words sincerely and smiled broadly. Seeing her smile, I felt a happiness I shouldn't have. A year has passed since I started attending the facility, and my parents seem to be in a better mood more often. With me not at home as much, they probably feel more comfortable without the bothersome baggage. Whatever the reason, I'm treated less like a burden by my parents now, so I've come to think that this situation is better for me. However, one day, my mother said something that would change everything. You don't need to go to the facility anymore. What? You're in middle school now, right? I think you can stay home alone without any complaints. I had made friends at the facility. Initially, I started attending because of my mother's insistence, but since I was treated as a nuisance at home, the facility had become an important place for me. So, I wanted to continue going there if possible. Okay. I won't go to the facility anymore. But I couldn't oppose my mother, so I had no choice but to accept it obediently. With me no longer going to the facility, I ended up spending more time at home. You're in the way. Don't move from the corner of the room. Being treated as a nuisance inevitably increased. If they think I'm in the way, I wish they would let me attend the facility again. I subtly asked my mother if I could return to the facility. I've been studying at the facility, so I can't concentrate at home. Studying is the same no matter where you do it, isn't it? I wonder how everyone at the facility is doing. Why don't you contact them? Don't you have their contact information? If not, you can call the facility and ask. It seems like the option of sending me back to the facility doesn't even exist in my mother's mind. I accidentally showed a look of dissatisfaction to my mother. Months later, having seen my expression, my mother might have felt a bit guilty and offered some welcome words. Nicole, shall we go out with your father? Really? Where are we going? It's a surprise, so just wait till we get there. Just being asked by my parents to go out made me feel like it was the happiest event of my 13 years. When my mother helped me into the car, I felt a heavy bag being placed on my lap. What's in this? Ah. Don't open it. It's a surprise for when we arrive too. Sorry. I won't open it, it's okay. As I attempted to open the bag, my father, who was sitting in the driver's seat, turned around abruptly and loudly stopped me. Startled by his loud voice, I accidentally apologized. As the car drove off, I excitedly watched the landscape passing by the window, wondering where we were going. After about an hour, I realized we were headed towards my maternal grandparents' house, which we hadn't visited in about 3 years and usually only see once a year. My excitement increased as I realized this. My grandparents' house is just over a mountain, and halfway there is a rest area with just a parking lot and vending machines. Tired from driving, my father stopped at this rest area, and I got out of the car to buy some juice. When I returned to the car with the juice, my parents were in the middle of a conversation. Mom called. She has an urgent matter and will be quite delayed. What? I wanted to get back early. Aren't we going to Grandma's house? Are we meeting here? Ah. Nicole. You're back. Don't start talking all of a sudden. You startled me. When I spoke to my parents, they momentarily looked shocked. However, their expressions quickly turned serious, and they began to say something devilish. Should we reveal everything now? I guess so. What are you guys talking about? Is it that secret you mentioned before we left? Yes. You know you're the baggage in our lives, right? So, we decided to get rid of unnecessary baggage. What? What are you talking about? As I struggled to understand the situation, my parents hurriedly got back in the car and drove off, leaving me behind. Wait a minute. In shock, I chased after the car, which I had no hope of catching. However, my panicked voice seemed to reach them as the car stopped a little way ahead. Relieved, thinking it was just a prank, I slowed my pace towards the car. As I got closer, my mother leaned out the window and shouted a farewell to me. Well then, take care. Don't let your disability defeat you. Live strong. As my mother threw the bag out of the window, the car drove away. Unable to accept that I had been left in the mountains, I was frozen in place. After a few minutes, realizing that standing there stunned wasn't helping, I approached the bag my mother had thrown. I picked up the bag and checked its contents. It was packed with clothes, and on top, there was an envelope. I assumed it was a letter from my parents, but I didn't have the courage to read it right now. Looking at the clock at the rest area, I saw it was already evening, and it would soon be dark. I couldn't even call for help, as my smartphone was left in the car. With no other option, I decided to wait in front of the vending machine for my grandmother to arrive. 2 hours later, it was dark, and I was cowering in fear. I thought it was the wind, but every rustling in the bushes sent an indescribable anxiety through me. The only comfort I had was the light from the vending machine. About 30 minutes later, a car pulled up. Nicole, are you alone? Kathy hasn't been responding to my messages. What's going on? Grandma. Seeing my grandmother getting out of the car, I was overwhelmed with relief and burst into tears. Despite being shaken by my sudden crying, my grandmother carefully helped me into the car, and we headed to my grandparents' house. On the way to my grandparents' house, I explained everything that had happened as best I could. It seems like my parents have abandoned me. What? Can parents really leave their child alone in the mountains? I had the same thought when my parents left me behind. But it really happened. But why would they do such a thing? They said I was life's baggage. That unnecessary baggage should be disposed of. No way, that can't be. Right. There was a letter. Since I didn't have the courage to read the letter myself, I handed the envelope to my grandmother. She pulled the car over to the side of the road and checked the letter. What does it say? It's written very politely that they can't afford to raise you, and they want us to look after you until they can pick you up. I heard from Ben today that he has to go on a business trip for a few days, and Kathy absolutely had to go with him, so they asked if we could take care of you for about 3 days. It seems they actually plan to leave you with us indefinitely. Why do you have this letter? It was in the bag. I see. So they couldn't say they wanted us to keep you permanently, so they made sure the letter would be found after leaving you with us. Not bringing you directly home was probably to avoid making it difficult to leave after opening the bag or entering the house and having a long chat. I think my grandmother's assessment is correct. Indeed, she is truly my mother's mother. She really knows my mother well. When we arrived at my grandparents' house, my grandmother explained the situation to my grandfather. Upon hearing the story, my grandfather was furious. What kind of people are they? Nicole, you don't have to go back ever. Stay here forever. I'm never letting them take you back. Seeing my grandfather's anger, I understood what real love was. It felt completely different from when I thought I was loved by my parents. I had been watching my parents' faces, hoping not to be seen as a nuisance. Realizing that was wrong, I felt freed from my parents' clutches. Today was overwhelming. Exhausted, I fell asleep at my grandparents' house without even eating dinner. The next night, feeling a bit calmer, I talked to my grandparents about my life with my parents. So, they hadn't just started calling you baggage yesterday. How could they say such horrible things? And they told you not to move from the corner of the room? What are they thinking? The more I talked about my parents, the angrier my grandparents became. My grandfather, in his anger, slammed his hand down on the table and spilled his coffee. I felt happy that they were angry with my parents. This happiness was different from what I felt towards my parents. It felt right to feel this way. But then, I said something that made their anger subside, and their expressions returned to normal. When they told me to stop going to the facility, I was really shocked. I had been going there every day for about a year. What? A year at the facility? The facility is kind of like an after-school program. I understand that, but every day for about a year? Yes, I was going there almost every day. What's wrong? The grandparents faced each other and began to whisper quietly. There seemed to be something odd about what I said. They explained everything in a way that even a middle schooler like me could understand. After hearing their explanation, I could no longer see my parents as parents. The baggage they were talking about was like an unnecessary extra tagging along for a purpose, wasn't it? Nicole, you are not baggage at all. Don't worry. Who really is the baggage, I wonder? Would you help me make them understand? Seeing my grandmother's confident smile, I felt reassured. I hadn't heard what she planned to do yet, but I had already decided to help her. It's been 3 weeks since I came to live with my grandparents. Things have been hectic, but life is finally settling down. Today, my grandparents had a day off from work, and we were leisurely sipping tea together in the living room, enjoying the peaceful time. As I savored the taste of the tea, I wondered if I could have such a peaceful life here. Then, a disruptive voice came from the entrance. It was getting closer to the living room. Mom and Dad. What have you done? My parents barged into the living room where we were sitting and started yelling. They were so angry that they were almost incomprehensible at times. Their expressions were a mix of anger and panic, almost hysterical. My grandparents and I, understanding what was probably going on, remained calm and continued sipping our tea. This seemed to infuriate my mother even more, and she yelled at us even louder. We're in big trouble because of this. What are you going to do about it? You don't have to shout. I can hear you just fine. My parents hadn't expected me to call them out on their loudness, and both were shocked, their eyes wide as they looked at me. I was free from my parents' control now and could say what I wanted. I was no longer the person who used to live with my parents. I've already heard from Grandma what might happen to you and Dad. What stage are you at now? It was your doing, wasn't it? We got a call from the office. They asked if Nicole was still living with us. When we said yes, they immediately knew we were lying. They didn't say much on the phone then, but this is definitely bad. It must be. I suppose they're advancing their investigation into the fraudulent claims. Even if we hadn't said anything, it would have come out eventually. How did you know about the fraud? I know receiving benefits fraudulently is wrong, but as a middle schooler, I don't fully understand how bad it is. Despite it not being hot, my parents' foreheads were sweating. Remember when Ben came to us to borrow money because his job wasn't going well? You refused to work because you wanted to stay a housewife, and when we told you to get a job, we sent you away. That happened, yes. I had thought my mother constantly talked about being poor as a way to teach me not to be spoiled or demanding. But it turns out we were actually poor. My grandmother had seen through my parents' fraudulent claims. Why did you put Nicole in the facility if you had no money? And you sent her there every day? I looked into it, and doesn't it cost over $10 each time? That was. I wanted her to receive training to survive in society. I struggled for Nicole's sake. No, that's not it. You just wanted to get rid of Nicole by sending her to the facility, didn't you? But you stopped after about a year because you had no money, right? Yes, we ran out of money and couldn't afford to send her to the facility anymore. What's wrong with that? Didn't you keep claiming benefits for a disabled child even after Nicole stopped attending the facility? It seemed my grandmother was right. My mother was trying to counter, but no words came out as she just moved her mouth. The cost to use the facility I was attending was just over $10 per visit, just like Grandma said. However, that was the amount paid by the users, and it seems about 90% of it was returned as subsidies. My parents kept claiming I was attending the facility and received these subsidies. So they thought they didn't need to keep you at home if they could get the disability child visitation benefit without you actually attending the facility? They figured they could just leave you with us, not have to bother with you, and still collect the money. You always take the easy way out, don't you? So you asked the office to investigate us. I didn't say to investigate directly. I just took Nicole here to our local office and said, here she is, supposedly living with her parents. Then I asked if there were any benefits received on their end that shouldn't have been if she's living here. The fact that they contacted you means our local office must have gotten in touch with yours. How can you read my mind like that? How long do you think I've been a mother? A real mother understands her children's thoughts. It's no wonder you find it strange since you never really acted like a mother to Nicole. Listening to my grandmother's words, I wondered if this was what a real parent was like. Kathy was overwhelmed by just words and collapsed on the spot. However, my father was still standing. It looked like my grandfather was going to handle him. Both of you are dressed nicely today. Kathy, that looks like an expensive bag, and Ben, that watch looks costly too. Did you buy those with the money from the fraud? No, this I actually bought with my own money. Oh. Weren't you poor before you started committing fraud? You had enough to buy nice clothes, huh? Don't tell me you've been using Nicole's disability welfare and special child support as pocket money? Now that you mention it, I did buy this watch recently. And I had to stretch to buy these clothes. Even as a middle schooler, I could tell his excuses were feeble. My grandfather looked me in the eye and chuckled. It seems he's leaving the final blow to me. Dad, you have a lot of clothes with the same logo, right? And not just clothes, you have plenty of expensive sneakers too, right? Mom, your closet is full of clothes, isn't it? Faced with an undeniable situation, my father also collapsed. I realized that the reason my mother always said we were poor was to prevent me from being spoiled or demanding. While they weren't living extravagantly, my parents did buy things they liked. However, I couldn't always get what I wanted as a child, and there was a time when I made a fuss about wanting a toy. That's when my mother started saying we were poor, so I assumed it was part of her teaching strategy. But it turns out my parents had been using the benefits they received because of me to fund their own desires. In a way, they were living off of me. So, it turns out my parents were the real burden. Everything is just as you and Dad said. It's all our fault. Nicole, I'm sorry for everything. From now on, I'll be a proper mother, so let's go home together. My mother, now tearful, apologized to me. It seems she had a change of heart. If I were the person I used to be, I might have been deceived by this. And then what? We go to the office together and say there's no problem because we live together? That way, the investigation might stop and you might get off the hook? Is that the only option you have left? How can a middle schooler like you think so far ahead? I thought you'd just listen like you always do. I wasn't really the one thinking ahead. My grandmother had warned me beforehand that at some point, my parents would try to take me back just to have me come with them to the office for that reason. It seems my grandmother is one step ahead as a mother. I've already told the office everything, so going there together now would be too late, wouldn't it? If they want to hear more, I'll just stick to the truth. Don't say that, help us out. If you come with us, maybe we can still be saved. Are you really going to abandon your parents? You too. Enough is enough. Are you really asking Nicole to help you cover up the fraudulent benefits? Exactly. You abandoned Nicole in the mountains in the first place. And now, when your situation gets tough, you ask for help. That's too much to ask, isn't it? The grandparents were furious with the parents and tried to kick them out of the house. However, being younger, the parents didn't move easily against the older couple's attempts. Being in a wheelchair, I couldn't physically support my grandparents, so I backed them up with stern looks. When our eyes met, my parents quickly calmed down and left the grandparents' house. After the parents left, my grandparents and I made fresh tea and enjoyed a relaxed holiday again. Later, my parents were arrested for the fraudulent receipt of benefits. Further investigations revealed that they had also fraudulently received grants. My father, who owns a construction business, had been remodeling our house to make it more accessible for me, and it turns out that up to 2/3 of these costs were covered by grants. He had been doing the work himself and overclaiming costs to pocket the grants. I thought he was diligently remodeling for my sake, but it was just for pocket money. The total amount fraudulently claimed was about $50,000. A fraudulent receipt is apparently considered a fraud thing. If this money isn't returned, there's a high likelihood of imprisonment. I don't quite understand how significant that amount is, but it seems like a huge sum for my financially struggling parents. They somehow managed to gather the money and returned it. However, the money they gathered was through loans. So the situation of having to repay $50,000 hasn't changed. Although the money was returned, they were found guilty. They didn't have to go to prison but received probation, which means they might still end up in prison in the future. I used to think that people who go to prison are called criminals, but being found guilty makes my parents criminals, as my grandmother explained. Criminals can't easily gain social trust, and my father had to close his construction business. Afterward, my parents tried to find jobs, but the label of being criminals was heavier than they imagined, and they couldn't find any work. Now, they are working part-time jobs to pay off their debts. I have been legally adopted by my grandparents and am living with them. Also, measures have been taken to ensure that any benefits or grants for me don't go to my parents. I don't understand much about money, but I am just happy to be living with my kind grandparents. I'm getting used to my new school. Now, I don't have to worry about my parents' moods anymore, so I plan to live life as myself.